Hello everyone, thank you for your invitation. It's truly a great honor to be here. As some of you may know, I grew up in a small town called White Rock in BC. I hope some of you are from the area. So it's great to be back, to be with fellow Taiwanese Canadians, and this brings back great memories of working with the very active community you have. I recall volunteering for Taiwan Fest, being at events in the Taiwan Presbyterian Church, and working at Metro Square in Toronto. Meeting Wu Yue Tian during Taiwan Fest probably was, and still is, one of the highlights of my career. I'm sure that my experiences mirror many of yours. I'm excited, really excited, to be joining all of you from Washington, D.C. You know that being here in D.C. is unlike any Canadian city I've lived in. One, we still use pennies here. Two, there are no night markets, so I can't get my yen suji or tsudofu. And honestly, you won't believe what a difference that makes. And three, we don't have Taiwan Fest, which is really an opportunity to show the wider community what being Taiwanese is all about. So Charlie, I hope you think seriously about expanding here next. I'll be your first volunteer, I promised, and I think you'll be very impressed with the turnout. You know, I never stop reminding myself on what an extraordinary journey it has been to have lived in Canada, moved back to Taiwan, and now being here as a diplomat representing the interests of the Taiwanese people. It's been an unforgettable process that started with writing my dissertation, to news articles as a journalist, to policy papers and speeches for the president, and now my remarks to all of you. I've been humbled and honored by these experiences and grateful for the two places I've called home, Taiwan and Canada. So let me start by saying there has never been a better time to be someone who's from Taiwan. We have so much to be proud of. We are a full-fledged democracy, one that is recognized around the world. We are at the forefront of civil liberties and personal freedoms, including as the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. We have handled the coronavirus pandemic well, and we're sharing what we call the Taiwan model with the international community, and we are seen as a bastion of freedom in one of the most important and strategic regions around the world, the Indo-Pacific. All of this means that people increasingly see us for who we are instead of what others want us to be. I'm sure all of you have followed the recent travel of U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar to Taiwan, the first cabinet-level visitor in 6 years and the highest rank in 41. His arrival in Taipei was the same day that former Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori led a delegation of DAI members to pay their respects to former President Lee. The sight of the two planes, one from the US and the other from Japan, contrasted starkly with the empty tarmacs that we've been used to and are a symbol of how far our democracy has come. When former President Lee first took his position in 1988, the same year that I was born, Taiwan was a far different place, and I know many of you know this era well. It was a time when dissidents were still being silenced, when people could be refused the right to go back home due to political beliefs, and when Taiwan had just started taking its baby steps towards becoming a free and open society. In 1988, the most important position President Lee could hold was not in the presidential office, but the KMT party headquarters across the street. And the electoral body that selected him for his first full term in 1990, the National Assembly, wasn't even comprised of voters, but lifetime legislators, some of whom had been in place since the 1940s. It wasn't until President Lee started to make more reforms, ordering the first full legislative elections, further removing restrictions on the free press, meeting with pro-democracy leaders, and then standing in for our first ever direct presidential election, did Taiwan's journey towards democracy become a given. All of this happened in my lifetime and many of yours. Consider that the same year China brutalized their own citizens that were protesting for democracy in Tiananmen Square, President Lee was making preparations to hold fair and open elections in Taiwan. And then consider how difficult it has been throughout the course of human history for leaders that have held absolute power then to give it up peacefully. The broader narrative of what President Lee did was not just about democracy. It was about forging a new path for Taiwan, one that was no longer defined by Chinese identity or our relationship with China. It was about forging a new sovereignty based on the 23 million people that call Taiwan home. It was about finding our own way and one day for our identity to become part of a global community of like-minded countries and nations that share our values and interests. And it was about being able and willing to defend and protect these values, even in the face of coercion and aggression that we see today. Today, 24 years after the first presidential election, and 2 decades after our first peaceful transition of power, this is exactly what we are continuously endeavoring to do. For myself, I didn't learn about this history growing up here in Canada. My impressions of Taiwan, shared I'm sure by many of the younger generation here today, was visiting relatives back home, the heat, mosquitoes, and brief mentions of politics, sometimes very passionately by family members following news programs or television talk shows. The parliamentary brawls I saw on television, coupled with the notion that politics were messy and best left alone, made the political situation in Taiwan even more foreign to me and many others, I'm sure. And as a result of this, the nuances of Taiwanese history, from our historical relationship with China, Japan, the Dutch, and many others, to the movements and leaders that eventually paved the way for a young democracy, much of this was lost to me. And it wasn't until I met members of the Taiwanese Canadian community in Toronto, when I started volunteering at events such as Taiwan Fest, and met more and more people from Taiwan, from all walks of life, that I developed a curiosity and thirst for more knowledge about Taiwan. So I'm forever grateful to this community and what it has done for me and so many others. I recall one of my first days working at Metro Square, when an elder in the Taiwanese Canadian community handed me a stack of books, this huge stack of books, ranging from Taiwan during the Japanese era to the various democracy movements in the 80s and 90s. He said at the time, and I only appreciated this comment years later, he said, "To work for Taiwan, you have to understand it first." Now, this curiosity eventually led me back to Taiwan upon graduating in 2009. I first worked as a journalist covering events such as the 2010 local elections, and then I fulfilled my military service. As a journalist, I was really fortunate to have met and reported on a very even-mannered, soft-spoken, and thoughtful politician, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, who later hired me in 2013. She had just come out of an election defeat at the time, and when she hired me, there were about a dozen people working for a foundation she had then established. Back then, it was far from given whether one day she would become president. All of this gave me front row seats to what became a rather remarkable journey. Dr. Tsai was elected chair of the DPP in 2014, became the party nominee the year after, and then won a landmark election victory in 2016. And I can say that having witnessed her personality closely as a journalist, and then as one of her political staffers, her conviction to continuing the legacy that President Lee had established in terms of deepening our democracy and forging our own path, none of this has ever wavered, not for a second. As she has said on a number of occasions, the most important thing we can do is to ensure that future generations will continue to have the ability to choose. Choose where they want their country to go, and to do so without fear or coercion. This basic fact, which is everything that democracy is premised on, guides all that we do. When I joined government in 2016, my first job was at the National Security Council, working for the current Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu, who some of you here may know well. For those that don't, Minister Wu is quite the force of personality, and I would always feel bad and yet be unable to change the fact that he would always be first in office and last to leave. He was very clear-eyed in terms of purpose and principle, and that is to survive in a region that is increasingly dominated by the PRC. It is absolutely essential for Taiwan to strengthen our relationships with other democracies, in particular countries that have a stake in the peace and security of the region. So building better relations with the United States and Japan were our top priorities. And we also look to forge stronger ties with countries like Australia, Canada, France, Germany, and the UK, and many other democracies around the world. In particular, we understood that to do so, there needed to be alignment not only in terms of values, but also interests, especially Taiwan's role in the cross-strait situation and the wider region. As George Washington had said, no nation is to be trusted farther than it is bound by its interest, and no prudent statesman or politician will venture to depart from it. Fortunately, President Tsai had laid out a clear and precise cross-strait policy that was very much supported by the international community. This was maintaining the status quo. Nobody wants to see the Taiwan Strait embroiled in conflict, least of all countries that could one day be drawn into such a situation. While the work to deepen Taiwan's democracy, to forge a stronger military, and to build up our economy would continue in earnest, Taiwan would also remain a principled and responsible steward of cross-strait ties. Few things would be more important, and this built on the foundation President Tsai had talked about earlier, which is preserving the next generation's ability to choose. Looking back, it's clear that this foreign policy has paid dividends over the past 4 years. As the picture of the 2 planes in Songsan Airport show, our relationship with the US and many other like-minded countries have never been better. We've seen the first ever public meeting between our national security advisors of Taiwan and the US. We've seen the increasing scope and presence of the president's transits in places like Los Angeles and New York. We've witnessed the passage of the Taiwan Travel Act and then the Taipei Act. And the Taiwanese people listened as Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger spoke in Chinese to congratulate President Tsai's re-election victory, while Secretary of State Mike Pompeo released an unprecedented statement. I could go on and on and on. But what's equally as important are all the substantive cooperation that is happening across the board, from security, investment and trade, to support for Taiwan's international space. One example is in our diplomatic allies. Previously, our relationships were bilateral, meaning one-on-one. Today, our work involves the US and many other like-minded partners. We're engaged with US government institutions, such as the Development Finance Corporation, to find joint opportunities to invest and fund development work, including in some of the most far-flung corners of the world. We've sent joint trade and investment missions. We've engaged in regional training workshops. This has made our diplomatic relationships much more resilient to China's efforts to switch them. Another example is Taiwan-US cooperation on a host of global issues ranging from counterterrorism to religious freedom. Few people may know this, but Taiwan is a member of the US-led global coalition to defeat ISIS. We've actively given support for humanitarian assistance, stabilization in war-torn areas, and are contributing to help displaced communities. And in terms of religious freedom, following a ministerial conference hosted last year by the US, we hosted the first ever regional meeting in Taipei. Months later, our ambassador in New York joined President Trump in a landmark speech that he gave within the United Nations for the very first time. Health cooperation is of course another important area, and when Secretary Azar was in Taipei, we signed a new MOU to enhance collaboration on health, particularly in response to COVID-19. Taiwan's response, which has been based on the principles of transparency, accountability, and technology, forms the basis of what we call the Taiwan model, and this is a model that has been shared across the world. It is a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that is spread by authoritarian countries that only dictatorships, only countries that have authoritarian governments can effectively manage the pandemic. And it is a model that we're working with the US to publicize. All of this is reflective of the strong base of trust and respect that exists between Taiwan and the US today. We see examples of this elsewhere in the world as well. In terms of Japan, for example, we saw the successive renamings of Japan's representative office in Taipei, and then our government agency managing Japanese issues. Prime Minister Abe has engaged in Twitter diplomacy with our president, trading greetings and well wishes. For Australia, we recently noticed that for the very first time, a joint statement with the US reaffirmed Taiwan's important role in the Indo-Pacific region and its quote-unquote resolve to support Taiwan. And in Canada, perhaps most of you saw how Prime Minister Trudeau publicly expressed support for Taiwan's international space and participation in the WHO. Again, I could go on and on and on. But the most important thing is that in all of this, we see a common theme, and that is Taiwan is no longer alone. Because of the Taiwanese people's commitment to democracy, because of leaders like President Lee that set us on the right path, Taiwan is integrating itself into this community, what we call the like-minded countries, nations that share our values and interests. We're finding our place on the international stage, which is an essential part of forging our own identity. I'm grateful to have played a small role in this in my current capacity and invite everyone in the audience, particularly the young people, to also think about how you too can play a role. So let me draw to a conclusion by stating that while we are moving in the right direction, we should never take our accomplishments or the very basis of our democracy for given. The stakes are far too high, and the forces that are moving against us are too great. We look at Hong Kong and the cautionary tale that holds, and we look at what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur community, and we see this increasing sophisticated tools and options that authoritarian regimes can use against democracies all over the world. So we have to be clear-eyed in terms of the challenges we face. The first and foremost of these challenges is China's growing authoritarian and expansionist tendencies. The PRC has made it a priority to dominate the Pacific. They've militarized the South China Sea, increasing the risks of accidents and miscalculations. They've also engaged in increased military tensions across the Taiwan Strait and greater actions to undermine and degrade our democracy and government institutions. This is what we call hybrid warfare. Again, we've seen the terrible things that have taken place in Hong Kong, and we note that the CCP would like nothing more to see it repeated in Taiwan. Related to this is the growing incompatibility between the Chinese system and democratic like-minded countries. We see this in terms of the US-China competition on issues ranging from 5G to trade, and in places from Africa to the Pacific. Being here in the US, we know that this is not a partisan issue. There is genuine concern across the political spectrum towards what we are faced up against. But even closer to places like Canada, where all of you are from, this is exemplified by the influence campaigns directed at local politicians, control over student organizations, and infiltration into media outlets. Much of this has been widely publicized, and the gulf shows no signs of narrowing. And the last point I'll make is this. As a counterpoint to all of this, Taiwan's democracy has never been stronger or more vibrant. People in Taiwan are aware of what is at risk and the actions that we must take to protect our democracy, freedoms, and way of life. We saw this when hundreds of thousands of young people came out on the streets during the Sunflower Movement in 2014. And we see it today, as evidenced by the formation of new political parties, by record high election turnouts, especially amongst young people, and by the growing numbers of young people who are willing to stand up and say they're willing to defend our country. While I cannot predict what the future holds, I can say that there is a lot at stake. And as a democracy, nothing is more important for us to confront these challenges together in a way that represents the collective will of the people. As a free and open society, we would expect nothing less. There's a role for all of you to play in this. As Taiwanese Canadians, you embody the very values that bring our two countries together. I've personally experienced the importance of learning more about Taiwan and being curious about what sets Taiwan apart from our neighbor across the strait. But there is more to it. And all of you are, in your own ways, bridges from Taiwan to Canada. And by sharing Taiwan's story, our successes, our challenges, our fears, and even a Taiwan model of our response to COVID-19, you act like voices for our 23 million people. You strengthen Taiwan's role in the community of like-minded countries, and that is an important guarantor of Taiwan's security. So let me end on this personal note. As I stand here talking to all of you today, I cannot be more grateful that you've taken time out of your very busy schedules, out of your work and family obligations, to listen to me and to participate in this gathering of Taiwanese Canadians. I know firsthand the love and admiration many of you feel towards Taiwan, and you cannot be prouder to see all that it has accomplished. I hope all of you will continue to play a role in Taiwan's story in so many ways possible. Throughout the history of Taiwan, the future has never been certain or given. Today, in our own small ways, we have an opportunity to change that. Thank you.